Mr. Poilievre, Catherine Cullen, CBC Radio's The House.
Yes.
If the Liberals do not put forward a budget, they don't indicate that they're going to do that in the coming weeks, will you support their tax cut?
I have to see what they're proposing. They, so far in the election campaign, they proposed a very small, very, very small savings. We think it should be a big savings. Canadians are...
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is trying to use Mark Carney's own words against him. Carney likes to say that a plan beats no plan. But the Liberals won't be putting forward an economic plan anytime soon. No budget in the coming months.
The first step of this government is a middle-class tax cut. That's the first thing. You start with that. Then you say, well, you need to have a throne speech to say...
And as Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne tried to explain to reporters, the next vision for the country's finances will come in the fall economic statement, which will be in the fall sometime.
This is the logical piece.
Here at this point, right?
Wow,
we're just gonna go to fall without a budget.
Fall is fall, you know. I could not be clearer than that. Fall is fall. So fall.
I'm Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, new cabinet, new problems. The Liberals are getting heat for not banking on a budget this year, and their housing minister sparked controversy when he said housing prices do not need to go down. The new Industry Minister Mélanie Joly will give us her take on it all. Plus, our journalist panel dissects Carney's cabinet choices. Paul Wells and Shannon Proudfoot join me. Also, we'll dig into why politics could be complicating how some provinces respond to the measles. But first, Carney's cabinet. Is it change for the better? The House is now in session. To talk about some of the challenges facing this new cabinet, Mélanie Joly is the new Minister of Industry. We spoke Friday afternoon while she was in Bécancour, Quebec, meeting with aluminum industry workers. Hi there, Minister. Congratulations on your new role.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be on the air and talking to you.
Well, I want to talk about the conversations you were having with those workers. What are you telling them about how long this trade war is likely to go on?
Well, it was really good for me to be meeting them very quickly. It's been only 72 hours I've been appointed because, as the former foreign minister, I used to work on the causes of the trade war, much more on the diplomatic front. And I wanted to go and work on the consequences of this trade war and much more on the economic front. And so what I saw and what I heard from them is, of course, they're really proud of their work, but they're anxious. And sometimes that anxiety goes into angriness because, there is a feeling that this is unfair, and it is completely unfair. And meanwhile, I met with the workers, but also I met with the management. And, this trade war has been going now on for a couple of months. And bit by bit, the American tariffs are biting and hurting even more the aluminum industry. And I know that's the case for the auto industry in Ontario and also the steel industry across the country. And so I want to be in solution mode. We have imposed counter tariffs against many American products. It has generated revenues for the government, and we've said that all these revenues would be given back to Canadians and workers, particularly in the affected industry. So how do we...
So, Minister, I'm going to jump in here because that's your plan. But my question is, what can you tell them about how long you expect the trade war to last? I understand offering them reassurance, but I'm asking about timelines here.
Well, listen, it's not as if we could be in a world where we could have a deal within weeks, and we could be in a world in which we could have a deal with President Trump within a couple of months. So we know, coming out of the White House, where I was with Prime Minister Carney last week.
Is that likely, though? I mean, that's an extraordinary timeline.
Well, the UK just signed a deal with the US now. The UK was in a different position. Following Brexit, they've been wanting to sign a trade deal with the US for a long, long time. And
it's a deal that kept some level of tariffs in place, too, which Canada, I understand, isn't interested in.
No, that's it. But, Catherine, I'm talking about the mindset of President Trump right now. His goal is to definitely make sure that he's able to sign deals. He got also some of the tariffs against Chinese products down. He's under immense political pressure in the U.S. to stop this unpredictability that is coming out of the White House when it comes to the economy. So we need to be strategic. How can we have the best deal to make sure ultimately that we're able to have a strong economy? So meanwhile, my two priorities are what? First, really supporting the affected industries and understanding what's going on the front lines of this war. And that's why I'm in Bécancour right now and an aluminum plant. And my second priority is because of all these trade decisions that President Trump has made, it has created a really big chill on economic investments across the country and across the world. So that's really not good for our workers, and it's not good for our economy. So we need to create a form of economic certainty. So when thinking of what we'll do with tariffs, I'm really thinking of also how can we make sure that we entice investments in our aluminum plants, in our steel sector, and also in the auto sector. So I'm trying to do take one measures and have two impacts. That's the goal, but that's why I wanted to be on the ground here meeting with people.
That uncertainty that you mentioned, the finance minister also talked about the economic uncertainty as a reason, he said, that your government is not putting forward a budget this year. Are you blaming the trade war for the lack of budget?
Well, listen, this is a conversation and an answer that the Minister of Finance can provide you. What my point is, I think Canadians ought to know what's going on with the economy. I think it's important that we share that information. And
so why aren't you?
Well, I think, we're coming up with a fall economic statement, and I'm convinced the Minister of Finance, being a seasoned politician, will be able to address this issue. Meanwhile, what I'm trying to do is really to be able to use some of the funds that we have already to make sure that we don't fall into a worse economic situation, that we're able, through the support of government, but at the same time in the context of retaliation of this trade war, to make sure ultimately that we don't worsen the situation. So that's why I'm here.
I appreciate that ultimately the budget is the finance minister's responsibility, but you are now in an economic portfolio. I'm sure you have seen some of the reaction to the decision not to have a budget this year. Derek Holt, he's the vice president and head of capital markets economics at Scotiabank, says Canadians have a right to know the state of the government's finances, like how bad they are now and the planned consequences to deficits and debts. Otherwise, it feels like Canadians basically wrote a blank check on April 28th when they granted a minority government to the Liberal Party. What would you say to that?
I would say that I agree with the fact that we need to be able to share information. I think it's important. I think that that's the goal of the government.
But again, you're not doing it, Minister. So how do those two things coexist?
I am convinced that the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister will be in solution mode. So I'm confident, and I think...
I don't know what that means, Minister, in this context.
It means that the Finance Minister will be able, of course, to share information. He will be doing his job. He's been appointed 72 hours ago. He'll meet with the analysts. He'll meet with the key decision makers. He'll work with the Prime Minister. And of course, our goal is to make sure that we're focused on the economy.
You seem to be suggesting that he ought to or will give information to Canadians then sooner than the fall economic statement. Is that what you're getting at here?
Well, it's a decision that he needs to make. You're talking to the Industry Minister, Catherine. I know you want to get an information from me. I'm not in charge of the file, but I'm really there to support him to make sure that he can thrive in his job. So this is a government that was just appointed. The throne speech will be coming up, and I'm convinced that we'll have more to say on the state of the government's finances in the coming days.
I do want to ask you about one other thing that one of your colleagues said this week. The new housing minister, Gregor Robertson, says he doesn't want house prices to fall. And I can understand why your government might want to protect the value of many people's biggest assets. When you're looking at folks, though, who can only dream of owning a home, you are, if you're saying you don't want house prices to fall, effectively saying they're going to have to wait years to buy. Economist Mike Moffat, who your government has consulted frequently, found that if prices were flat, it would take between 20 and 40 years for houses to be affordable, attainable to the middle class. Are you willing to live with that in order to keep home prices from dropping?
we need to increase the supply. And that's exactly what the Minister of Housing was saying, who has a lot of experience being the former mayor of Vancouver. And so that was their entire plan, to make sure that we have more homes being built across the country. Everybody that is paying a mortgage right now, or everybody that is paying rent, knows that it's too high. And it's been going on for too long. So that's why we came up with a plan, a very ambitious one that includes also the fact that the government will get involved into building homes. And so I look forward to seeing what the throne speech will say about that, and also what the Minister of Housing will be working on.
But you were just on the doorsteps. You were just knocking on doors, Minister, during the campaign. Surely some folks said to you in your writing, I cannot afford a home. Did you tell them, sorry, housing prices aren't going to drop and you may have to wait years?
No, I didn't say that to them, because of course they're concerned and they're anxious. And so we have a duty to make sure that we're bringing down housing prices. Meanwhile, when I look at housing prices, what are they linked to? They're also linked to how you build homes, Catherine. And how you build homes is also through sometimes steel and aluminum products. Just think about windows and think about doors. And so right now, I'm at an aluminum plant, and it's affected by 25% tariffs, which drives costs really high.
But do you agree?
Wait, Catherine.
Okay,
I want to finish my answer. So at the same time, more we're able to be in solution mode to find ways to keep our aluminum plants working, to make sure that the costs are not too high, that we use our way not only through our tariffs money, but also our new defense procurement to create jobs across the country, which will help also support the steel and aluminum workers, because obviously when you're investing in defense, you're investing in equipment, and there's a need for steel and aluminum. Well, then we can get also to a much more affordable economy. So that's the goal. I know that I'm putting a lot of different items on the table, but they're all linked. And meanwhile, being the former foreign minister, I know how much geopolitics is having an impact on affordability and also the economy. So I'm trying to link everything together.
Well, I do want to ask you about something directly related to your file in closing,
go
which was the bad news that landed just as you were being sworn in.
Yeah,
Honda announcing this week
know.
that they're postponing this $15 billion electric vehicle project. They have since also said that some of their production will be shifted to the U.S., though the company says it has no plans to cut jobs in Canada. Do you see reason to be worried?
So, I was informed of that decision the day I was sworn in. So within 24 hours, I was talking to the president of Honda Canada to make sure that jobs would not be lost, that conditions of workers would stay stable, the same, and at the same time, to make sure that we can continue to work on the EV sector and their investments. So I think there's two things. There are the tariffs that are coming from the White House against the auto sector. And so the company is taking its own decision to make sure to offset some of these tariffs, and that's the goal, and we'll work with them on that. And we've been working with the auto sector because we want to make sure that people keep their jobs. But what Honda was taking as a decision is much more linked to their future investments on electric vehicles and the fact that they will be building electric vehicles. That's also affected right now by the fact that President Trump has decided to not go ahead with the Inflation Reduction Act, so the IRA, which was a huge undertaking of President Biden in order to support a lot the auto sector and the electric vehicle sector. So right now, although the U.S. is going in one direction, we think we should be continuing to invest in electric vehicles because we think that's the future. And so that's why I'll be continuing to work with the different CEOs of the auto sector, with the different labor organizations, but also I want to be able to work with the governments of Japan, Korea, and also European governments, which are all linked to these investments. So
we've got to leave it there, Minister.
We'll find a way. Thank you.
We are right out of time. Thank you for making time for us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Bye-bye.
Industry Minister Mélanie Joly. Now, let's take a closer look at Mark Carney's new cabinet.
We need to balance experience and new perspectives. Canadians voted for big change, not small change. They voted for big change.
The experience comes from Trudeau-era stalwarts like Dominic LeBlanc, Anita Anand, and Sean Fraser. But there are also ministers who publicly pushed for Justin Trudeau to go, like New Brunswick's Wayne Long, who sounds much more enthusiastic about the new PM.
I think we're going to see our government run like a corporation, which I think is long overdue.
Then there are some faces that are totally new to Parliament Hill.
Mr. Hodgson, how are you feeling about your new role?
Hi. We look forward to building, and I look forward to digging in.
Carney's cabinet has 28 ministers, 29 when you count the Prime Minister himself, plus 10 secretaries of state who are also ministers, but not part of cabinet, though they can be invited to attend some cabinet meetings if it's relevant to their file. So what does it actually mean for getting work done on behalf of Canadians? We talked to some of the new recruits.
Can we ask you a quick question?
Hi. Very nice to see you.
Starting with BC's Stephen Fuhr, the Secretary of State for Defence Procurement. How is this Secretary of State business stuff going to work? Your defence procurement, we have a procurement minister, we have a defence minister. Where do you fit in? How does this work?
We're driving the car and changing the tire on the car as we're driving the car. So right now I'm working with both those ministers to deliver on what's in the hopper that's being delivered.
Here's Secretary of State for Sport, former Olympian Adam Van Couverden.
For what it's worth, my team and the department have been calling me minister, and my name's on the door, and I'm excited to lead on the sport file.
Secretaries of State don't get their own department. They work alongside Cabinet. Ruby Sahoda's file is a hot political topic. She's the Secretary of State for Crime Prevention.
So basically, we're carving out a lot of the criminal portions of the work that the public safety would be doing.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is, as a Secretary of State, you're not at all of the cabinet meetings. You're only brought in when your issue is on the table, and yet the Prime Minister has said this is a main priority. So how can we reconcile those two things, it being a main priority and yet you not being at the table a chunk of the time?
Well, I get to do the focused work all of the time, every single day, and when this issue is the main issue, then of course I would be involved in the conversation.
All 10 provinces have a minister, and there's one from the territories too. At a time when national unity is straining in some parts of the country, Secretary of State for Rural Development, Buckley Belanger, says he'll be making his province's concerns known.
As a Saskatchewan boy coming to Ottawa to try and do my very best to represent our province, the whole premise is to make sure that all levels of government understand what frustrates our province. And I think the Prime Minister has a good handle on that. But clearly what we want to do is tell Saskatchewan, you're a big part of Canada. We are going to work very hard as an MP to engage the provincial government and bring forth their concerns to Ottawa so we can be one big happy family.
But does this mean the Prime Minister?
Now, you don't choose your family, but Carney did pick his cabinet. So, will they be a happy unit? We've got two Hill watchers to share their thoughts. Paul Wells is an author and podcaster here on the Hill, and Shannon Proudfoot is with the Globe and Mail. Welcome back to the house to you both.
Hi there.
How are you doing?
Good. Excited to talk to you guys about this. I want to start with kind of the premise for Mark Carney's cabinet. He said change, and Canadians didn't want small change, they wanted big change. Is this change, Shannon?
I'm going to say it is, at the risk of sounding like I'm agreeing with his thesis, because we were sort of talking before we started taping here about how it's hard to keep track of how many new players there are. In a straight numbers, people in, people out, there's a lot of new faces there. There's a lot, presumably, hopefully, new ideas. Some of the most prominent players are the same, and I think that's where he's getting grilled on it fairly enough. To me, the big question now is how much are you going to let those smart people you've assembled around that table have their say, have their way?
Paul, change?
Yeah, I mean, clearly they had a specific plan. The Prime Minister has said enough in the last week that half of the faces are new, that it's pretty clear that was actually the first decision they made rather than the product of all the other decisions.
It's good that I'm a sucker for marketing, but anyway.
I think it actually does make decent use of the talent in the caucus while inevitably leaving some prominent MPs disappointed. One of the secrets of life in Ottawa is there's actually more people who could be good at these jobs than there are jobs available, even in a surprisingly large cabinet. But one thing I think the Prime Minister will have to learn quite quickly is you have to demonstrate change every day. You can't do it every cabinet shuffle day.
Indeed. So, Shannon, you have an array of folks to choose from between the cabinet themselves and the secretaries of state. What's one pick that stood out to you?
I thought it was interesting. He has a record number of Indigenous people in the cabinet, right? Between 2 ministers, I believe, and 1 Secretary of State. And I thought it was noteworthy and interesting that we got 0 sermons about that this week. It was just, he has advertised himself as a pragmatist. There was one brief moment on Tuesday where he was sort of asked about the makeup of the cabinet, and he kind of flicked at, I don't want it to all be people who look like me. I think it's pretty powerful to just say and imply that you're just picking good people for a job. And as I said, the second part is, are you going to let them do that job without making it a big deal? Because Trudeau absolutely would have given us a value statement attached to that. And I think it's powerful to just put those people in those roles and let them do those roles.
This is something someone said to me about him. Like, he doesn't do value statements, and that as they're sort of casting the language for the things that he does, if someone suggests hope, he says, no, let's do plan, which I think is interesting. Paul, what's one part of this cabinet ministry process that interests you?
I'm struck by how a lot of the familiar faces get to stay familiar. The Dominic LeBlancs and the François-Philippe Champagnes of this world. And one minister I've taken an interest in is Anita Anand, who was impressive from the beginning in 2019 and has not been permitted to plant her feet and write her action in duration, as we say in French. And now she's the foreign minister, having been essentially unceremoniously yanked out of a previous job as defense minister. And we will see. I mean, she replaces Mélanie Joly, who has been foreign minister for 4 years. And now we will see whether in a very outward-facing government, whether she and the new defense minister, David McGuinty, can be a team and can be effective. It's a big test for a big talent and an interesting question mark over this government.
One thing that's interesting about her job is that it starts out, she goes into it as a big job. 2 of her previous portfolios kind of accidentally turned into huge stinkers and really, really difficult things, right?
Vaccines,
when they were supposed to,
right? Is the
vaccines,
obvious one,
procurement, and defense in a different way. They were supposed to be sort of more dull, less in the spotlight, and then they kind of exploded. This one, she's starting with, I guess, an explosion in her hand, or whatever the right analogy is here, and it's hers.
And a lesson to perhaps all of the new members of the ministry, right? Which is, you think your job is one thing, events, dear boy, events. You're going to find out
sometimes
that's
don't stay
it.
Sleepers.
Shannon, let me ask you, this idea that there is cabinet and then there are secretaries of state. How well do you think that's going to work?
I don't know. I mean, we've heard a lot about this. There was the telegraphing ahead, the leaks about the 2-tiered cabinet idea. Carney has underlined over and over that it is a smaller cabinet, so it seems important to him. The mechanism of it is that they will only attend meetings when it's sort of like they're kind of opted in as opposed to being opted in by default. So it suggests to me that it's important to him to keep it lean. I wondered if that was sort of an almost begrudging answer to the criticism he got with that cabinet that lasted 9 days. I wish I could count up the number of hours that was between him becoming leader and calling the election.
Technically, they get the election campaign. Sure. I'm sure they'd like
Let's
me
give
to point
it to
that
them.
out.
Their Wikipedia entry, it would be that long, 6 weeks long. But there was criticism then, right, that there was no Minister for Status of Women, Minister of Labor, things like that. I wonder if this is sort of a begrudging answer to that, because he has talked about this being a lean, mean wartime machine. We are focusing. It is narrow. We are getting stuff done. We're getting it done fast. I'm a pragmatist. Did I mention I'm a pragmatist? Like, that's his thing. And then you have these secretaries of state who are sort of toe-touching on these other issues that still apparently have to be served for political reasons, but he really still wants to keep the core group small.
I want to talk about something we didn't see this week and won't be seeing anytime soon, by the sounds of it, which is the budget. The fact that the Liberals won't be putting out a budget this year. Paul, we heard Mélanie Joly's defense of it a moment ago. I want to know what you make of the decision to go sans budget.
I have had Liberal friends explain it to me and explain why it makes perfect sense. It makes no sense at all to me. We're more than a year since the last budget. The last budget was not well received. They ended up campaigning against that budget to a great extent. Okay, great. Then now what are you going to do instead? I would be willing to entertain an argument that the budget should come fairly late in the game. I mean, Paul Martin's first budget when the Liberals, I'm the guy who remembers this stuff.
That's why we have you here.
When the Liberals got elected in 1993, Paul Martin's first budget, which was delivered very quickly after that election, is still talked about today by old-timers as a essentially disastrous budget. So take more than 60 days, absolutely. But at the end of that process, and the other thing that's striking is François-Philippe Champagne's inability to explain the decision persuasively in either official language in the first couple of days.
He called it transparency, and I'm having a hard time with how not giving people information is transparency.
So one thing I have been railing for years against the tyranny of message discipline in this town. And what we saw this week was that a little message discipline comes in handy. If you're the housing minister, having a ready answer to the question of what should housing values be when you're done comes in handy. And I suspect there's going to be a little bit more attention paid to preparing to give answers. But what we learned from the Champagne thing is they have to be answers. They can't be the line again. You can't give the line 7 times and then get mad that they didn't understand it.
I hope many members of the political class are listening to us today. Shannon, I do want to ask you about Pierre Poilievre. Is there a thought you want to share on the budget quickly?
I share Paul's bafflement because the excuse they put, to the extent that they've explained it, is there's too much uncertainty in the world, which is a real good reason for giving yourself a baseline and everyone else a plan for how you're going to deal with it. So I don't understand it either.
You and I were both at Pierre Poilievre's second news conference this week. It is clear he is attempting a tone with fewer hard edges. Do you think it will stick?
Well, I hope this isn't a Weasley answer. I think the answer will be if it sticks and if it takes. Because so far we've seen him talking about listening and learning and saying some magnanimous things that I have not heard from him before. You know, he's very good in that prosecutor role, and he said our job is to hold the government to account. We will do that. But he's also talked overtly about we will work with them if it's in service of Canadians. That does the neat job of giving him plenty of room to define what is or isn't in the service of Canadians. But that's not a sentiment I've heard from him before. But I really think that the proof is in the pudding here. If he sticks with it, if there is a shift, and it's also possible he could address whatever he decides were the deficiencies in this election campaign or in his connection with Canadians. He could look within himself and make some adjustments. He could decide that resides outside of him. Maybe that resides with giving the heave-ho to Jenny Byrne or some other external changes. And there's just not a way to answer that now. And part of that is because of the nature of Pierre Poilievre. He's 127% himself. He has been that guy since he was not even just 24 elected to Parliament, since he was 17 writing letters to the editor. Like, I'm not sure I've ever observed anyone on the public stage who is more enduringly themselves. And so it is hard to imagine a shift, and it's hard to even imagine him being at peace with a shift. So we'll see.
Paul, at the same time that Pierre Poilievre seems to be trying to project this more collaborative tone, I noted Deputy Leader Melissa Lantsman posted on Instagram that Anita Anand, quote, is from the Hamas wing of the Liberal Party because of her comments this week about food aid to Gazans. Can the Conservatives do both things? I mean, they're not here to be the nice guys. They're the official opposition. But can that tone, the sort of Hamas wing tone, credibly coexist with, we want to work together in service of Canadians?
I mean, to some extent, we're talking about two large parties that both have problems of message discipline. I got to say, using terms like the Hamas wing is what gets you sent to Ottawa again and again by voters in Thornhill. More generally, there was a lot that the government put on the table this week that was fair game for legitimate opposition criticism. This was a good week to be the official opposition. But it's also encouraging to see Pierre Poilievre seeming to have learned some big, obvious lessons that I'm amazed he didn't learn earlier from his experience. I would add a couple more items to his homework list. The whole playing tough thing, the one reason it rang hollow was because he was actually clearly phobic about putting himself at risk of being misunderstood, of being disagreed with, of having to reconcile his vision with anyone else's. Yeah. And that's actually politics. That's actually leadership. One thing he said near the home stretch of the campaign in a succession of interviews was that someone after the election was going to have to bring the country together. And in the past, he's talked of his admiration for Wilfrid Laurier as a great conciliator. okay, great. Theoretically, he wants to be that conciliator who brings the country together. And I don't think a lot of voters had ever seen that from him. And he might want to put that on the table before the next time they vote.
Okay, always great to speak to both of you. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Shannon Proudfoot and Paul Wells. Lots more coming up on the House podcast, including the riding that was decided by just one vote. But is it over? I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure you give us a follow so you never miss an episode, and tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca.
There's a law. It appears clear. We have a case. We go forward because we want this election to be held properly. And that's it.
That's Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet announcing that his party plans to challenge the election results in the Montreal area riding of Terrebonne. That riding since the election has flipped 3 times. First, it went Liberal by 35 votes. Then all the ballots were validated and it went Bloc by 44 votes. Then, after a judicial recount, it went back to the Liberals by just 1 vote. To help us with the twists and turns and what comes next, Holly Ann Garnett is an associate professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. She studies election integrity. Professor Garnett, welcome to the House.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. We were just talking there about how the numbers have jumped around. Help us understand why they can change significantly in each of these steps.
The reason we've seen the count appear to change is largely because of the way that we count ballots and the way that we double and triple check the results. So on election night, the results are going to be coming in 1 ballot box at a time. After all of the votes have been counted, there is a validation process. And that's where all of the materials from polling locations, the tally sheets, the ballots, they all get brought to each local returning officer. So that's the individual in each riding responsible for running the election. And so that person is then going to go through all of the tallies, not the ballots, just the tallies and statements of votes, again in the presence of candidates' representatives. And so it's really just a process of going through the results one more time just to make sure that everything matches up. And that's why the results might appear to change again at this stage.
And then the judicial recount can be triggered if the margin of votes is small enough. And in that case, they really are going back and looking at every single vote, right? That's why the numbers might change again. It's not just the tallies, but the individual votes.
Exactly. At this point, the actual ballots can be recounted, and that includes looking again at any ballots that might have been rejected in a previous count. Maybe they were not marked correctly. But that's something that they can go through every single ballot again. And then the judge who does that judicial recount will issue the final results.
Then we end up with this high drama difference of 1 vote, and people come forward and say their mail-in ballots didn't make it to Elections Canada. If they had been counted, it could have potentially swayed the election results. Is there any way those ballots can now be counted?
No, my understanding is that once the judicial recount has been finalized, that is the end of the process there. That is the final results for that election. But there is another option, and that is for a candidate or an elector to contest the election.
And is that likely to succeed? I mean, this is what the Bloc Québécois is doing.
Exactly, yeah. So it's possible. I think it's above my pay grade to know exactly how the judge will rule on that. But essentially, it needs to reach a level of an irregularity that would have affected the election results, which, given that it was 1 ballot, is likely to be the case. And then it would be their decision whether to annul the election results. And at that point, you would go to a by-election.
Now, there were a few more potentially significant recounts. If we look at Milton East, Halton Hills South, on election night, that went Conservative. It's now been decided for the Liberals. There's also Windsor-Tecumseh Lakeshore. There, the Conservatives are in the lead, and the judicial recount begins Tuesday. What does the flipping and flopping we've seen tell you about the integrity of our election process?
Flipping and flopping is really showing that our safeguards are working as intended, right? Because there are safeguards in place to ensure that the will of the electors is being represented. These sorts of judicial recounts are not uncommon. Usually there's a handful of recounts that happen after every election. They do happen automatically anytime the margin of victory is less than 0.1%. And again, it's the product of a system where elections are being decided in 343 ridings, and so results can often be quite close. And that judicial recount is just one of the safeguards put in place to protect the democratic process.
Well, and on that note, this time, of course, because we're so close to the difference between a minority and a majority government, and because social media is so present, you see people who seem to be assuming that there are bad motives, online, that, the reason the number of votes being counted is changing, or the reason the results are changing is because there's something nefarious happening with our system. Do you worry about the faith of some Canadians being undermined as this process is going forward right now?
So this is obviously a very unfortunate situation. It appears that a mistake was made, and that is concerning. But there's also lots of reasons to be confident that the system is working as intended. So the first is that Elections Canada is not investigating itself. It's going to be a judicial process to ensure that they're not investigating a complaint made against them or against their own returning officer. So that's a really promising thing, that we have that separation in Canada so that someone can be doing that investigation independently. And the other thing that I would say that I find quite promising is that the candidates and the parties have been quite gracious in this situation. There was one instance potentially of a Conservative email coming out about Liberals tipping the scales, but other than that, I haven't heard too much about the rhetoric about stolen elections. And that's quite promising because a lot of candidates and parties around the world have done this when there are close races.
Okay. Professor, I really appreciate your insights on all of this today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Holly Ann Garnett. When the measles hit Alberta, there were questions about why the Chief Medical Officer of Health wasn't speaking up more, whether he was even being muzzled. Well, Dr. Mark Joffe left as top doctor, and at a recent lecture, he spoke his mind.
I think there has been a complete failure of leadership at all levels, and there's public complacency.
How could politics be playing into some provinces' response to this highly contagious disease? Dr. James Talbot was Chief Medical Officer of Health in Alberta from 2012 to 2015. He's now a public health professor at the University of Alberta. And Dr. Kumanen Wilson is Chief Scientific Officer at the Bruyère Health Research Institute and a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to the House to you both.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
Dr. Talbot, I do want to start with you. With a highly contagious disease like the measles, how much does the provincial health response, in terms of awareness campaigns and having the top doctor speak out, how much does that matter?
Oh, it matters an enormous amount. The thing about measles, as you mentioned, is that it's highly contagious. You can acquire it by spending time in a room where a measles patient was in an hour before. That gives you an idea. And that, coupled with the fact that up to 16 people who've been exposed may go on to develop measles, shows how big the risk is of acquiring it. It also has very serious consequences for some of the, particularly the children under the age of 5, things like deafness, brain damage, and death.
And so obviously an incredibly serious disease. I'm wondering about the difference that public health awareness can make, though. How big is that?
Because of how serious it is, an important part for public health is that the entire community is aware, first of all, of what the disease looks like so that they can self-isolate, so that they can take a look at whether their children are immune or not, and if they're not, to make sure that they get the vaccine. So having the general public aware of what's going on and taking the measures that they can do on their own is hugely important.
Dr. Wilson, I want to ask you how we're doing nationally. I mean, Quebec was able to actually declare an end to the measles outbreak there. What does the picture look like across the country?
So, I think some of our challenges over the years has been not having adequate information on managing outbreaks like this, and particularly having registries that monitor our vaccination rates. I actually think Alberta probably has really good data compared to Ontario because their public health nurses provide the vaccines. So they actually have the information to make the decisions they need. A really big problem in Ontario is the inadequacy of the data. Before the age of 6, we really don't know, and then the self-report after that. And their reports say 70% coverage rate, which cannot be true. There'd be much larger outbreaks. So, yeah, and this varies from province to province.
You're talking about the data about immunization
vaccination,
rates.
yeah. And so this varies from province to province. So there is quite a mosaic across the country, and that influences how the outbreaks are going to manifest. And then the second factor, which is our specific community. So even if you have a decent vaccination rate, if you have clustering of unvaccinated people in specific community, then we know that to be the case in Ontario. That really creates a scenario where outbreaks can happen.
Dr. Talbot, what do you think of that?
Well, it's true that we have data in Alberta on the 2-year-olds, and it's comprehensive, and it's excellent data, but it just goes to show that you can have the best data in the world, but if you don't have the political will, you still have a problem.
Dr. Talbot, you are, as we said, a former Chief Medical Officer of Health in Alberta. The situation we talked about at the beginning, Dr. Joly not being as vocal as some would have liked. What is your understanding of what was up there?
For those who don't follow Alberta politics that closely, it has its start in COVID, where towards the end of the outbreak, the Chief Medical Officer of Health was basically fired by the government. And then when she found another job unrelated to the ministry that she'd worked in and had accepted the offer, the Alberta government stepped in and hounded her out of that. So when Dr. Joly took over, he was initially an interim chief MOH because he lacks public health qualifications, training, and experience. But he is an infectious disease specialist and very knowledgeable about measles. And I've known Mark for 30 years. And the idea that he wouldn't have wanted to go out in public to let people know what was going on, what they could do about it, and where to go to get vaccines is just laughable. And yet I think he spoke twice in the entire 2 years in spite of public demand for him to be in front of the public.
So I said at the beginning, I mean, this is a question of the intersection of health and politics. To you, this was just about politics?
It's hard to take any other conclusion that the chief MOH was let go. Just as we had the most number of cases in a week in Alberta, we had 100. And when you take into account population, that means it was a worse week than Ontario has experienced in 10 months. And we got to there in 3 months.
So I do want to say, I should mention that Premier Smith has suggested that Dr. Joly, she wanted him to accept an extension of his contract. He didn't. It expired. You said let go. That is not what the province says. And provincial officials were pushed on this question of where was he. In early April, they said our response is appropriate to the current circumstances. If the situation escalates and a province-wide outbreak is declared, we anticipate Dr. Joly speaking more broadly to Albertans. As you said, he's gone now. There is now a temporary Chief Medical Officer of Health. He has done a news conference. He has written an op-ed. Is it your sense that things are getting any better in Alberta?
They got better last week with the minister finally admitting that measles was serious and there were complications that needed to be looked at, and the vaccine was safe and effective. So to that extent, it got better. But it takes time for a campaign to penetrate the public consciousness. It takes time to get people to be able to make the changes to their schedules, to get their kids in. They have to be able to actually book an appointment. And then there's another 10 to 14 days for the vaccine to become effective. And so what you really want to do is get ahead of the curve on these things. And, in Alberta, the inability of the chief MOH to speak out for whatever reason has meant that the province has squandered the opportunity to protect the most vulnerable during that time.
Which could obviously have some pretty serious health consequences.
Well, for every 1,000 cases, you can expect 1 to 3 deaths, and that happens with every 1,000. If you're a physician who's ever seen how severe measles can be and know that it's preventable, you never want to get into a situation where there's even 1 death.
Dr. Wilson, I wonder how you would compare that to what's happening in Ontario. I mean, the Premier was asked about this recently. He talked about specific religious communities that were perhaps more averse to vaccination. How does that contrast to the Alberta picture?
My thinking on this has evolved over time. I remember during Listeria, I was fairly outspoken saying we needed to hear more from the Chief Public Health Officer, but I realize it's a complicated calculus, and speaking to the importance of public health, it crosses so many sectors. Obviously, the role of public health officials is to speak up on behalf of public health. The more independent they are, the more at risk they are of being sidelined and not participating in the decision-making process. And governments are going to win if there's ever a battle. They can cut the budget, they can sideline the chief public health officers.
You're saying they have to play a bit of politics in a sense?
To be maximally effective, I think they need to be. I think Ontario's got a complicated situation because, coming out of the pandemic, there was a loss of trust in certain communities and certain religious communities. And if you're trying to regain trust in those communities, the last thing you want to be out doing is saying, well, this is an outbreak that's really restricted to these communities and really calling them out. So, that's a challenge as well. I think what we really need to be vigilant on in Ontario is the risk of those outbreaks bleeding into the broader population, and that will require a lot of monitoring, and ideally we'd have better data on our vaccination rates.
So if we look to a solution, if you're saying you don't want people to feel called out, the answer you say is data, but surely that's only part of the picture.
Yeah, traditionally you ideally find a champion within the community, and I know that that's what they're working on, who can bridge that trust. This is a trust gap right now. And they don't trust public health, so public health can say a lot of things, and they may not listen or pay attention to it. So you have to find subtler strategies to re-engage those populations. And then ultimately, you also have to make sure the remainder of the population is protected, and that's where the data really comes in.
Dr. Talbot, what do you think about that assessment applied to Alberta, because obviously it has its own unique politics around some of these issues?
If you take a look at what the immunization coverage rates are for 2-year-olds in the province, it's the ideal is 95%, which gets you herd immunity. So the percentage of 2-year-olds who've received the required 2 shots is 68% province-wide. And it's in the 70s in Edmonton, Calgary, but for the rest of the province, it's 50% or below. Wow. So this isn't just, in fact, in some communities, the rates are in the 10 to 20% range, which is worse than the third world.
Oh, my goodness.
So
what do you attribute that to?
Well, it's not just religious communities. That's absolutely clear. Part of it, I think, was the pandemic. Public health had a lot on its plate. In Alberta, after the pandemic, the government started blowing up the healthcare system and firing CEOs and the board. And so there's been chaos at a time where public health needed to have more resources to be able to reverse those problems. And clearly they haven't gotten there yet. And now this latest issue with the chief MOH being allowed to leave during the crisis just shows more bad planning on the part of the government.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you both for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. James Talbot is a professor at the University of Alberta and a former Chief Medical Officer of Health in Alberta. Dr. Kumanan Wilson is a professor at the University of Ottawa and CEO and Chief Scientific Officer at the Bruyere Health Research Institute. Okay, that is it for us this week. Our crew on the House is Emma Godmere, Benjamin Lopez-Stephen, Victoria Valito, and our senior producer this week is Kristen Everson. Thanks also to Miguel Plant and Caitlin Crockard. I'm Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.